Evangeline Hartwell had done the mathematics 17 times in the carriage ride to Ashford Manor, and the equation always balanced the same way. 20 years of correspondence divided by 412 letters equaled one wedding. Tonight's announcement would simply formalize what had been inevitable since she was 17 years old. She'd kept every letter Theodore Kingsleigh had ever sent her, archived chronologically in leather portfolios. Letter number 47 discussed crop rotation. Letter number 153 debated canon ethics. Letter number 289 asked her opinion on parliamentary reform. Not once, not in 412 letters, had he written the word love. But he'd written respect 37 times, partnership 42 times, and your counsel 68 times. Evangeline had thought this meant something. She'd been a fool. The ballroom glittered with witnesses as she stood in her ivory gown, cataloging details with the precision that had defined her entire preparation for this moment. 243 guests. 16 servants circulating with champagne. One duke walking toward the dais with the confident stride of a man about to fulfill an obligation. Then his eyes slid past her to someone in the crowd behind her, and Evangeline felt the air change. "My lords and ladies," Theodore's voice carried across the room with devastating clarity. "I have gathered you here not to announce my wedding to Lady Evangeline Hartwell, but to declare the end of our betrothal." The gasps came in waves. Evangeline remained perfectly still, her mind already calculating the social mathematics of public humiliation. But Theodore wasn't finished destroying her with precision. "Instead, I ask for the honor of Lady Seraphina Hartwell's hand in marriage." Her sister. Her careless, laughing, uncomplicated sister who'd never studied anything more demanding than watercolors, and who'd somehow been writing to Theodore for the past 3 years without Evangeline's knowledge. 3 years of what? Letters that made him smile instead of think? As Seraphina stepped forward, guilt and triumph fighting for dominance on her younger face, Evangeline understood with brutal clarity. She'd optimized herself into obsolescence. She'd become so perfectly qualified for a role that she'd forgotten to remain human enough to be wanted for it. The equation had been wrong all along. And there were 243 witnesses to her miscalculation. Evangeline remained frozen for precisely 5 seconds, a lifetime in the currency of public humiliation. Then her training seized control. A duchess, even a rejected one, did not crumble before witnesses. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake within, "I appreciate your candor." The word landed like a stone in still water. Around them, the assembled nobility watched with the hungry attention of those witnessing history. Social capital was being redistributed before their eyes, fortunes rising and falling with each passing moment. She understood power dynamics better than most. In aristocratic society, perception was reality. Theodore had just repositioned himself as a man choosing passion over obligation, a romantic figure rather than a man breaking his word. Clever. Devastating. "I hope," Evangeline continued, turning to face the crowd rather than her former betrothed, "that everyone will join me in celebrating this. unexpected development. After all, love should triumph over arrangement, shouldn't it? The statement was a masterwork of social maneuvering. By blessing the union publicly, she reclaimed agency. By questioning the nature of their original arrangement, she reminded everyone that Theodore had benefited from 20 years of her patience while pursuing his ambitions abroad. She curtsied, not to Theodore, but to the room, and walked toward the exit with measured steps. Each footfall was an act of will. Behind her, she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, her father's growled curse. Outside, the night air struck her face like a slap. Evangeline pressed her gloved hand against the cold stone wall, and finally allowed herself to shake. 20 years. 20 years of becoming someone worthy of standing beside a duke, only to discover that worthiness itself was the problem. Theodore wanted someone who hadn't sacrificed everything. Someone still capable of spontaneous joy. The cruelest part? She couldn't entirely blame him. Seraphina found her 3 hours later in the manor's library, surrounded by estate management texts Evangeline had been studying. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "Evie, please! Let me explain." Evangeline didn't look up from the ledger. "Explain what? That you've been corresponding with my betrothed? That while I prepared myself to be his partner, you were becoming his confidant? It wasn't like that." Seraphina's voice cracked. "It started innocently. He wrote to ask about you, and I just wanted to help." "Help." The word tasted bitter. "You helped him fall in love with you." Seraphina sank into a chair, her younger face showing every year of guilt. "I didn't mean for this to happen. But Evie, you changed yourself so much for him. You used to paint, remember? You loved philosophy, and would argue about ethics for hours. Where did that woman go?" The question struck deeper than accusation ever could. Evangeline had indeed reshaped herself, following advice from every etiquette manual and marriage guide. She'd learned that successful partnerships required compromise, that women of her station must be ornamental yet useful, accomplished yet deferring. "I became what was required," Evangeline said finally. "You became what you thought was required," Seraphina corrected. "And in doing so, you disappeared." It was the truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Evangeline had over-optimized herself into someone unrecognizable. She'd studied psychological principles of attraction that emphasized mystery and independence, then interpreted them as requiring her to become a perfect, distant ideal rather than a real person. "Does he love you?" Evangeline asked. Seraphina's silence was answer enough. "Then I suppose," Evangeline said, closing the ledger with finality, "you've won something I was never truly competing for." The scandal rippled through society like a stone through a pond. Lady Hartwell took to her bed with nerves. Lord Hartwell threatened to call Theodore out before his solicitors reminded him that dueling was illegal and financially inadvisable. Evangeline found unexpected clarity in the chaos. She began to see her situation through an economic lens, not in crude terms of money, but in the broader sense of resource allocation and investment strategy. She had invested 20 years of human capital, her time, energy, and identity into a single venture without diversification. Every business primer warned against this. Every investment guide counseled spreading risk. Yet in matters of the heart, women were encouraged to place all their eggs in one basket and watch that basket obsessively. The realization was both liberating and damning. Her friend Catherine, a widow who managed her late husband's shipping business, visited with unconventional comfort. "You know what Theodore's mistake was? He failed to recognize appreciating assets. You've grown more capable, more interesting, more valuable every year. Seraphina is lovely, but she's maintained herself at the same level. You're not losing value, Edie." He simply lacks the vision to recognize growth potential. It was such a clinical way to discuss heartbreak that Evangeline almost laughed. Almost. "The marriage market doesn't reward growth in women over 30, Evangeline said. "It rewards youth and pliability." "Then perhaps," Catherine suggested, pouring tea with steady hands, "it's time to exit the marriage market entirely. There are other exchanges worth participating in." The idea was radical. A woman of her station, unmarried and approaching 40? Society would consider her a failure. But society had already witnessed her public humiliation. What more did she have to lose? "What did you have in mind?" Evangeline asked. Catherine smiled. "Have you ever considered that all those years studying estate management weren't wasted? Just misdirected?" 6 weeks after the betrayal, Evangeline purchased a small estate in Derbyshire using funds from her grandmother's trust. The property was struggling, mismanaged by an absentee landlord, and now in need of someone with vision. It was perfect. She applied everything she'd learned, but this time for herself. The tenant farmers, initially skeptical of a woman landlord, found her surprisingly knowledgeable. She introduced crop rotation principles she'd read about in agricultural journals, implemented fair rent policies based on yield rather than arbitrary figures, and invested in infrastructure that would benefit everyone. The work was exhausting and exhilarating. For the first time in 20 years, Evangeline made decisions that weren't filtered through the question of what a future duchess should know. She was simply herself, capable, strategic, and finally autonomous. Her parents were horrified. Her mother sent increasingly desperate letters about Evangeline, throwing away her prospects. Her father threatened to cut her off, then realized she was already financially independent. News of her endeavor reached Theodore through society channels. He appeared at her estate unannounced on a gray Thursday morning, finding her in the fields consulting with a tenant about drainage issues. "Evangeline!" His voice carried that familiar authority, but she was no longer the woman who'd shaped herself to complement it. "Your Grace." She didn't curtsy. "You're far from West Haven. I heard about your project. This is beneath you." She felt something shift inside her, not anger, but a cool assessment of the man before her. Theodore Kingsleigh was handsome, accomplished, and completely unable to see beyond the conventions that had shaped his worldview. "No, Theodore," she said quietly. "Being beneath you is beneath me. This is exactly where I belong." Seraphina's wedding preparations were elaborate and joyless. Theodore spared no expense, but there was something performative about it all, a man proving to society that his choice was worthy of their approval. She found herself making excuses to visit Evangeline's estate, ostensibly to repair their relationship but truthfully to escape the suffocating weight of her impending marriage. "You seem happy," Seraphina observed, watching her sister review accounts with a steward. "Genuinely happy. I'm building something real," Evangeline replied. "That tends to generate satisfaction. Do you hate me?" The question hung between them like a sword. Evangeline set down her pen and really looked at her sister, saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she held herself as if braced for impact. "I did," Evangeline admitted. "But hatred requires more energy than I'm willing to invest in you." It was brutal honesty, but Seraphina seemed to prefer it to false forgiveness. "He doesn't love me the way I thought he would," Seraphina confessed. "He loves who he thinks I am. This spontaneous, joyful creature who hasn't been dimmed by responsibility. But Edie, I'm 33. I'm not actually that person either. I just never had to prove otherwise." Evangeline recognized the pattern. Theodore had fallen in love with an illusion both sisters had provided, each in different ways. She presented perfection. Seraphina had presented perpetual youth. Neither was sustainable. "Then why are you marrying him?" "Because I destroyed your life for this. I can't waste that sacrifice by backing out now." The logic was twisted but understandable. Seraphina had invested her betrayal. Now she felt compelled to see it through. It was sunk cost fallacy applied to matters of the heart, throwing good years after bad because the initial investment hurt too much to abandon. "That," Evangeline said gently, "is the worst possible reason to marry anyone." Theodore stood in what would soon be Seraphina's apartments at Westhaven, surrounded by decorators and feeling profoundly alone. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and he couldn't shake the growing sense that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Seraphina was lovely, certainly, charming in social settings. But in private moments, he found himself searching for the depth he'd expected and not finding it. She deflected serious conversations with humor, avoided discussions of estate management, and seemed content to be decorative rather than collaborative. He'd wanted someone who hadn't sacrificed joy for duty. Instead, he'd found someone who had never developed the capacity for either sacrifice or serious purpose. The contrast with Evangeline haunted him. He'd read reports of her estate management, glowing accounts of innovation and fair dealing. The woman he rejected for being too competent was now demonstrating that competence in ways that benefited dozens of families. His own steward had mentioned her crop rotation program with admiration. "Lady Evangeline has a sharp mind for agriculture, Your Grace. Perhaps you might consult with her regarding our northern holdings?" The suggestion had been innocent. The sting was sharp. Theodore had spent 20 years waiting for Evangeline to become someone worthy of his position, never recognizing that she'd surpassed him in many ways. He'd wanted a partner who enhanced his status. She'd wanted a partnership of equals. His error was confusing ornamentation with substance. Now he was weeks from marrying a woman who made him feel less lonely without actually being a companion. It was a special kind of hell, one entirely of his own making. His secretary entered with the day's correspondence. Among the letters was one from Evangeline, formal and businesslike, proposing a land exchange that would benefit both estates. It was brilliant strategy, requiring no interaction between them personally. He stared at her signature and wondered when he'd become so foolish. The morning of the wedding arrived with unseasonable rain. Seraphina sat in her dressing room, surrounded by attendants and feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The wedding dress, French lace, obscenely expensive, felt like a beautiful prison. Her maid of honor, Catherine, who'd befriended both sisters, entered and dismissed the other attendants with a look. "You don't have to do this," Catherine said quietly. "Everyone's here. The Archbishop is waiting. Theodore is making the same mistake again," Catherine interrupted. "Marrying someone he doesn't truly know. And you're enabling it because you feel guilty about Evangeline. But Seraphina, your sister has moved on. The only people still trapped in that ballroom 6 months ago are you and Theodore." The words broke something open inside Seraphina. She thought of Evangeline, who'd turned public humiliation into private triumph. Her sister had lost everything and found herself. What had Seraphina gained? A duke who was settling for her, and the knowledge that she betrayed family for a man who loved a fantasy. "If I don't marry him, I'm the jilt who destroyed 2 betrothals. If you do marry him, you're the woman who spent her life performing happiness. There's a cost-benefit analysis here, and neither outcome is perfect. But one at least leaves you free to find something real." Seraphina looked at herself in the mirror, really looked. She'd never wanted to be a duchess. She'd wanted to be chosen, to matter to someone in a way her accomplished older sister seemed to matter to everyone. Theodore had offered that validation, and she confused it with love. "Help me out of this dress," she said finally. 45 minutes later, she stood before Theodore in traveling clothes, her wedding gown abandoned upstairs like a snake's shed skin. "I can't marry you," she said. "Not because I don't care for you, but because neither of us are in love with real people. We're in love with ideas." Theodore looked at her, really looked, and saw someone younger than him in more than years. She was right. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. The guests were informed. Society would talk for decades. But Seraphina walked out of Westhaven with her head high, finally ready to discover who she might be without her sister's shadow or a duke's expectation. Theodore arrived at Evangeline's estate 3 days after his non-wedding. She was supervising the construction of a new granary, covered in dust and more vibrant than he'd ever seen her. "I suppose you come to blame me for Seraphina's decision," she said without preamble. "No," he replied. "I came to apologize, and to understand how you managed to become so thoroughly yourself while I was busy creating museum pieces of everyone around me." She studied him with those sharp eyes he'd once found intimidating. "You wanted a partner who enhanced your status without challenging you. That's not a marriage, Theodore. That's interior decoration. The assessment was harsh and accurate. Theodore had viewed marriage as the final achievement in his collection, a beautiful, accomplished wife who would reflect his taste and position. He'd never considered what she might need from the arrangement. "What do you need?" he asked, genuinely curious for perhaps the first time. "I needed a partner who saw investment potential rather than immediate returns," Evangeline said. "Someone willing to grow alongside me rather than expecting a finished product." "You wanted the butterfly without being present for the chrysalis." "Mixed metaphors aside, you're correct. I was a fool." "Yes," she agreed, "but an educable one, hopefully. You're 40, Theodore, not dead. You have time to reconsider what partnership actually means." They talked for hours, the first real conversation they'd had in 20 years of correspondence. Evangeline explained her theories of mutual investment in relationships, of compound growth over time. Theodore listened and recognized that he was learning from someone who transformed disaster into wisdom. "Is there any chance," he asked as the sun set, "that you might consider—" "No," she interrupted firmly. "You want redemption. That's not the same as wanting me." It was another truth he needed to hear. Chapter 9. The Inheritance. 1 year after the infamous non-betrothal, Evangeline hosted a harvest festival on her estate. Her tenants flourished under her management. Her agricultural innovations had attracted attention from the Royal Society. She'd published 2 papers on estate management under her own name. Seraphina had traveled to Italy and discovered a talent for languages. She sent letters full of wonder about art and architecture, finally pursuing interests rather than approval. Theodore had not remarried. He'd instead begun implementing Evangeline's land management strategies and had, by all accounts, become a better landlord and a humbler man. Catherine attended the festival and found Evangeline watching the celebration with quiet satisfaction. "Any regrets?" Catherine asked. "About Theodore?" "No. About the 20 years I spent becoming someone else." Evangeline paused. "Surprisingly, also no. I learned valuable skills, even if I learned them for the wrong reasons. The education wasn't wasted, just misdirected. There's talk that Lord Ashford's been making inquiries about you." Evangeline smiled. "Lord Ashford owns 3 textile mills and shares my views on labor conditions. If he's interested in discussing partnership, actual partnership, not ornamentation, I might be inclined to listen." "You've changed the rules entirely, haven't you?" "I've simply insisted on playing a different game. The marriage market wanted me to decrease my value to increase my appeal. I refused. And it turns out there's a small but significant market for women who appreciate rather than depreciate." As night fell and lanterns lit the celebration, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 decades: peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose. She'd been born to marry a duke, raised to be perfect, and betrayed into becoming real. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the best thing that could have happened. Theodore watched from the edges of the festival, uninvited but not unwelcome, and understood what he'd lost. Not a wife, but a true partner. The difference he now knew was everything. And that's the end. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story from this channel. Please like and subscribe to this channel. It will help others come across this channel faster, and they'll fall in love with these captivating Victorian-era romance stories, just as you did. Bye for now.